The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister John Dale.
In our series, Tell Me the Stories of Jesus, we look today, those who were ready, the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew chapter 25, and I'd like to read verses 1 to 13. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them. But the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, Behold, the bridegroom is coming. Go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, No, lest there should not be enough for us and you. But go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered and said, Assuredly, I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. By way of introduction, these 3 parables in Matthew 25. This one, first of all, the virgins, 10 virgins. The next is the parable of the talents, and the next is the parable of the sheep and the goats. These 3 parables in Matthew chapter 25 are an outgrowth of Jesus' discourse to his disciples on the fall of the city of Jerusalem and the time of his second coming. That's from chapter 24. Jesus warned that his arrival would come unexpectedly and would find many unprepared. His command is watch and be ready. When you read Matthew chapter 24, the earlier verses will describe situations that would be characteristic at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. As you keep reading, Jesus will switch gears on the same general theme, by the way. But he will say, But of that day and hour knows no man. And he begins to describe what will happen when he comes back. Now, trying to make signs mean things is a dangerous practice. But reading what the text says, we come away with the understanding that when the Lord comes back, and he will, Jerusalem's already been destroyed. AD 70, history tells us about that. But the Lord hasn't come back yet. He's coming, and he's a week closer than he was last time we met. But he's still on his way. He's still planning to come. You can count on it, but you can't set a date for it. So what he's saying is things will be going on as usual. There'll be somebody asleep, of course. There'll be somebody at work, of course. And so on one side of the earth it'll be dark, and that's when you expect people to sleep. On the other side there will be work going on. There'll be family vacations. There'll be the normal things happening. People will be in school. People will be building houses. All these things that we do, just normal daily life. And that's when the Lord's going to come back. That is, no special sign of his coming that would give us anything like a date that we could set. And so the Lord is simply saying to us in this particular passage, be ready. The marriage feast under consideration. Weddings were especially important in ancient Jewish culture. They always have been, of course. The 10 virgins or bridesmaids in the parable awaited the arrival of the groom so that the marriage feast could begin. They brought lamps fueled by olive oil, but the 5 wise ones were prepared These maidens also brought an extra oil supply. The bridegroom, who comes from a distance, is Christ. The time of his coming is unexpected, and the maidens who are waiting are his professed disciples. We'll start drawing the lessons from it pretty easily because it fits right in with the context and with what we already know about the Lord and what we now have the advantage of looking back and seeing what was going on. We know history now, whereas history was being written, history was being developed and unfolded at the time of the writing and the speaking of Christ. But you have a wedding feast that is about to begin. You had the engagement, the betrothal, and then you had the wedding and the celebration of it that would last as much as a week or maybe even more than that. A lot of feasting going on, a lot of celebrating going on. And the more wealthy the families involved, the longer the celebration might last. But what we have is the bridegroom who is delayed. He is coming, but he hasn't gotten there yet. And they can't have the dinner, they can't have the full feast until he's there. And the bridesmaids are there waiting for his arrival, 10 of them. 5 are wise enough to bring extra oil with them. 5 of them aren't wise enough to bring the extra oil, and they have to go somewhere and buy some. It's a simple, everyday story, but it's one that teaches some very valuable spiritual lessons for all of us. Let's notice what cannot be done. Jesus' original audience was his own disciples. Committed disciples need to be duly warned. There are some things the disciples cannot afford to do. And we're basing it on what is said in the parable, basing it at the same time with application to us as his disciples. Number one, we cannot neglect preparation and still be ready at his coming. Verse 13 of Matthew 25 says, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. The 5 wise maidens were prepared, the other 5 were not." You cannot neglect preparation and still be ready at his coming. In everyday situations, don't we know that? When you were in school, some of you are still in school, do you remember when you had assignments that were due, you had papers that had to be written, you had tests to study for? And if you were like me, you found about 1,000 other things to do because you were not faced with the immediate due date, you were not faced with the immediate time of the test, and you had these other things that were honorable enough, but they took your time. You allowed them to take your time. And before long, you began to feel rushed. And then we did what we call cramming for tests or writing all night long. I remember when we were doing some graduate work, those papers, those lengthy papers that were due, many of them were written starting in the afternoon before the next day when we left to go to school, and it took all night long. Now, some of us say we work better under pressure. We probably make up other stories too, because really working under self-induced pressure is not always good and it's not always bad. It needs to be moderated to where it works for you rather than against you. Most of us never learned how to study. We just studied in our own ways. But preparation for a test or preparation for a presentation is one thing. Preparation to meet the Lord in the final day is in principle the same kind of thing, but it is so much more important to be prepared to meet the Lord. And it's so much wiser to be preparing along so that there's not that last minute rush, especially if we don't know when He's coming, and we don't. So one thing we cannot do is neglect preparation and still be ready at His coming. We must remember to watch and pray, be ready, stay ready, and then enjoy the state of readiness. Second, what cannot be done? We cannot borrow what must be bought. Character is like that. It cannot be loaned from person to person. God expects personal commitment and obedience from each of us. Each of us is personally accountable to Him. 2 Corinthians 5:10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the deeds done in his body according to that which he has done, whether it be good or bad. And then Romans 14:12, each of us shall give account of himself to God. There are things that cannot be borrowed. They must be bought. The 5 foolish virgins left to go buy something that they had to have. The wise virgins are the ones who brought it with them. They were prepared. When it comes to character, you say, well, I don't have to worry about it because my family was honorable and my mother and dad and my grandmother and granddaddy were all honorable people and I came right along and I've got it made. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. It's up to you to develop so that people recognize that you're a person of character. Oh yes, it's an advantage if your family name is respected. But by itself, that's not going to get you through. That can stop with your generation. And what needs to be done is to be constantly aware of the fact that some things cannot be borrowed. They must be bought. Imagine coming before the Lord in the final day and saying, Lord, but I was a member of this or that or the other church. And we had so-and-so as one of our elders. Okay. So-and-so was our preacher. You remember him, don't you, Lord? Okay. We had deacons, and here are some of them. And you start naming honorable deacons. That's all fine. But the issue is not who were the elders and who were the deacons and who was the preacher. The issue is, what about you? What about me? There's some things that I have to do for myself. Galatians chapter 6 verse 5 says, each man shall bear his own responsibility. Ezekiel 18:20 says, the soul that sins, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, nor the father of the son. If you come from a long line of faithful and devoted Christians, congratulations. That is a real blessing. But it is insufficient for your eternal welfare. Some things cannot be borrowed. They must be bought. And then in the third place, we cannot neglect preparation and still be ready. We cannot borrow what must be bought. And we cannot recall lost opportunities. The 5 foolish maidens were out buying oil for their lamps when the bridegroom arrived. The feast had already begun. They did not seize their one great opportunity. Their exclusion was unalterably permanent. Sometimes opportunity only knocks once. And if we're not ready to seize that opportunity, then that door will be closed. There may be other doors open. But you and I need to recognize that those doors, when closed, are sometimes closed forever, and we have to go a route that we didn't plan at all. What about it as far as your work in the church and mine? What about it as far as other things in business, for instance? What about it as far as social situations are concerned? It means that we don't want to go with haste and make foolish decisions. But if we procrastinate, then there's always the opportunity that that situation will no longer be available to us. It causes us, hopefully, to want to pray for wisdom, to seek the blessings of God, the providential care and keeping of God, so that when we're looking at decisions and we're looking at opportunities, we know which ones to grab and grab immediately. And we know which ones to let slide, at least for a while. Is it easy to figure it out? No. No. I remember a friend of mine telling me who he was dealing with some real estate situations. He said he had an opportunity to buy a 50-acre tract of land for $3,000. This was many years ago. 50-acre tract of land for $3,000. He said, I didn't buy it because I didn't have $3,000. And I didn't really need it, and I wasn't sure that it would ever amount to anything anyway. So about 20 years after that, that 50 acres had been subdivided, and no telling how much money each parcel of land brought. Had he seized the opportunity, he could have made a tremendous amount of money. But he didn't know, and he didn't have the wherewithal at the moment, and he wasn't sure he should go into debt, and he wasn't necessarily a good speculator anyway, and he didn't have any inside information about anything, and so he lost that opportunity. Now, when it began to develop in that part of that city, he could have gone running back to the owner of the 50 acres and said, I've decided I want to buy it. And the fellow says, well, that'll be about $750,000. Would you still like to buy it? Well, I don't have that much. I can't afford it. Could have bought it for $3,000. Admittedly, $3,000 in 1948 was a whole lot more than $3,000 is today. But the point is, if you don't seize the opportunity, there's a good chance the opportunity will pass. It could be that way in business. It is that way socially. Here you are in college and you're dating this particular person, and you say, now that's the kind of person I want to live with the rest of my life. I want to marry that person and have a wonderful home and children and all of those things. That's exactly what I want to do. But you just don't seize the opportunity. You're trying to be sure you have enough money in order to be secure before you get married. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many people are secure money-wise before you get married? Not many of us. If our honeymoon had lasted one more day, I'd have been completely broke. Completely broke. But the point is, you do seize the opportunity. You do or don't seize the opportunity. Or you don't seize the opportunity. The point is, we have to do what we have to do in order to look at the opportunity, to pray for wisdom, to study all the angles, and then we make a decision, a commitment, either to go that route or not go that route. But sometimes we say no, and there's no chance to say yes later. Sometimes we say yes and are glad we did, and sometimes it wasn't a good investment. But the point is, there are times when you cannot recall lost opportunities. They cannot be recalled. So what do we do with that by way of conclusion? We cannot neglect preparation and still be ready at His coming. We cannot borrow what must be bought. We cannot recall lost opportunities. Centuries later, the question still arises, when will Christ come again? That's the wrong question. What we should be concerned about, what should we be concerned about? Only whether or not our lamps are trimmed and burning. We must be watching. And the one sure way to be ready on that day is to be ready every day. That's the last statement in our lesson today. And it's the best summary statement I could come up with. The one sure way to be ready on that day, that is the day the Lord comes back and demands an accounting, is to be ready every day and enjoy the state of readiness. Become and be a faithful Christian. You'll never be sorry. You say, well, I'm going to live in the fast lane, in the wild and wicked ways until I get old, and then I'm going to give the Lord what's left. Well, that's foolish reasoning to start with, and there is certainly no guarantee you're going to live to be old. Best thing to do is become and be a faithful child of God right now, because you can't go backward. And then determine to be faithful for the rest of your life, even if that's a month or if it's many, many years. Be ready and enjoy being ready, and then when the Lord comes, you'll be glad you did. Thank you for being here today.
This has been It Is Written, a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God with John Dale, minister of the Glendale Road Church of Christ. Please visit us online at www.glendaleroadchurch.org.
When I read the life of the Apostle Paul, I read where he not only was converted in Acts chapter 9, and some of the details are included in that narrative. He then appears before the Jews in Jerusalem in a large crowd in Acts chapter 22, and he recounts what happened to him in chapter 9. He tells of his own conversion. He doesn't set himself up to be the example as though he were flawless in his life, but he sets himself to be an example of one who came to the Lord, and that they should too, because it's the right Lord. And then in chapter 26, when Paul is on trial before King Agrippa, or he's making his defense before King Agrippa, he does it again. So as we read in chapter 9, chapter 22, and chapter 26, we read of the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, who became the great apostle Paul. I want to tell you in a capsule what happened to me 50 years ago last night. And I want it, again, not to be that I'm your authority, but one who is appreciative of the teaching and the influences in my life that brought me to that point, and then the building that can be done and should be done on that foundation at a later time. Last evening, about 5:15, I was driving through Subway, the drive-through, because my wife told me that our grandsons would not like what we were having for supper and that they do like stuff from Subway. So I got their order, and I'm sitting in the line at Subway, and I looked at my watch, and it was 5:15. And I'm allowed to go back 50 years to 5:15 on December 22nd, 1957. And I remember where I was and what I was doing. I was at home. We were getting ready to go to church. That was 100% our practice on Sunday night, no exceptions. We always went to church on Sunday night. It was always at 6 o'clock. So at 5:15, I'm trying to decide whether I am going to have enough courage to make it down that aisle at Eastwood Church that night. I know I want to, I know I need to, and I know I'm scared to death. So what am I going to do? And so I'm back in the back bedroom, and everybody's home. It's Christmas vacation for my brothers who are in college. At that point, I suppose only Larry was in college. But we're all there. And I would really like to talk to my daddy about it before I go, but I'm not sure what to do about that either. I've never done this before. I've only been 11 once. And I've never been baptized before. So I don't know for sure what I'm going to do. So I decided not to say anything to anybody. So we get in the car and we go to church, and we get there as we always did, and we were early, and we left late. It's okay, it's genetic, it's okay. And so I sat down on the third seat from the front where I always sat, nearly always sat. And James Wells preached that night, and Gerald Sykes led singing that night, and he announced the invitation song, and it was Just As I Am. Well, that's my favorite. It was my favorite at 11. It's still my favorite invitation song. And so I got the book out and looked at it, and I said, right there, that's where I'm going. Beginning of the 3rd verse. And I hope some others have gone ahead of me, so some of the spotlight will be off of me. But I'm headed out on that verse right there. And so the sermon was finally over. I have never heard such a long sermon in my life. Have you ever been there? Don't raise your hand. But finally it was over. And we stood to sing the invitation song, and at the beginning of the 3rd verse, I looked down the aisle, down the row where I was sitting, and Jesse and Frances Kane were standing down there. And Frances looked over at me and winked. She was my friend. They have a daughter who's the same age as I am. We were in school together. She looked over at me and kind of smiled and winked, and I needed a little affirmation right then. And so I head down the aisle. It's only 3 rows, but it seemed like a football field. Sat down. James Wells kind of told me what he wanted to tell me about things, and he announced that I had come and that I stood up. He asked me if I believed in Jesus, and I told him I did, and I did. I did then, and I still do. And we went back to get dressed, and Gerald led the singing, and it was Standing on the Promises. The group was already singing by the time I'd gotten out of the auditorium. Got back and got dressed, was baptized, got dressed, and came back down and met with people, and everybody was pleased and congratulating and happy. And we got started home, and it was cold. It was very cold that night. And I was in the back seat of our 1950 black 2-door Chevrolet, and got home, and Daddy called some people who were not at church and told them about it. And it was a big night. It was a very special evening for me and for the family. Now, there's nothing dramatic about that. They didn't sing "Years I Spent in Vanity and Pride, Caring Not My Lord Was Crucified." I hadn't done anything for years. Miriam was baptized when she was 10, and they sang "Years I Spent in Vanity and Pride." I think that's fascinating, Miriam. You hadn't done anything for years. How much do you have to know to come to that point of obedience? Not a whole lot. But to know enough to recognize and realize and be impressed with the truth that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and He came to save sinners. And I recognize that I am responsible for my own attitudes, actions, and words. I don't know everything, but I know enough to know right from wrong. And I know that I've done wrong, and I know that I've sinned against the holiness of God. I could never define and delineate all the truths about atonement. I doubt if you'd asked me that night to explain expiation and propitiation, I would have corrected you some way for your bad language. The very idea of using words like that around me. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to become a baby. A struggling, stretching little baby who could start growing and growing and learning and falling and getting up and falling and getting up and falling and getting up and making progress in the walk for the Lord. I know that there are people, some in this room and others in our families and others of our acquaintance, who are at that point of trying to figure out what to do. Trying to figure out when to make that obedience known and make it official. I love the term confess and claim because it actually does acknowledge who Jesus is and what we need because of our sins, and then claim it on His terms by His merit and tap into His righteousness because we don't have any personal righteousness to bring to the table. So I haven't been saved because I'm good. I've been saved because God is good. I haven't lived a perfect life for the last 50 years as a church member. I've made a lot of mistakes. Some of them were inadvertent mistakes. I just didn't know any better. But I have to say that I'm smarter than that most of the time. I knew better. I've done stuff that I knew was wrong. I knew it when I did it. And yet I lived long enough to look back on it and say, that's not what I want for my life. I want a better life for me and for others, and I want my influence to be for good. And so I am a fellow struggler and fellow searcher with any and all of you who would, in humility, reach to the Lord. We can't do this alone. We're not here to go solo. So I want to encourage you to give it your best effort and take the hand of the man from Galilee and let Him walk with you.